Hey adventurers, so today is going to be another book review. This is going to be for The Buried Giant by Kazuo Ishiguro. This is an Arthurian. This is a kind of a journey. I don't really have a whole lot more to say about this book in terms of talking about what it is, genres that it falls into or anything like that. It is fantasy to some degree, but it's not super hard. There's not a whole lot of fantasy or magical elements in it, although there are some. But yeah, let's go through this and I'll talk a little bit more about this as I go. I have my notes on my phone today, rather than on my computer set up, and we're going to try this and see how it works because it's a little bit easier to set up and it's a little bit quieter for the microphone, maybe. All right, so The Buried Giant is set in a Britain that's post-Arthur. I read this with Liam from Liam's Lyceum because, well, he suggested it and because it's Arthurian. And I was all for reading it. Reading things, doing buddy reads, especially with Liam and stuff like that, are great, and I have no problem with that. And then also reading anything Arthurian, I'm always down to read something Arthurian if I've got a good reason to, which I almost always do. And to me, honestly, it's Arthurian is a good enough reason most of the time. But I had no idea what to expect with this. It seemed like it was going to be a lot less about the adventure and a more contemplative fantasy, which I was excited to read and find out more about. This is an interesting one for me, though. I really enjoyed being in the world of Arthurian stories. Once again, it's been a long time since I'd spent any amount of time in that world, and so it was really nice to be there again. And I did find the actual journey contained within these pages to be an interesting one. I liked the events that were actually happening in the story. Anytime we get to explore a world, especially with something like this, where we're seeing the aftermath of the fall of Arthur, I tend to enjoy it. I liked the voice that it was written in, kind of a mixture of like a Tolkien and a T.H. White almost, which actually works really well for the world. The author had an interesting way of telling this story that was far from our modern subgenre of cozy fantasy, but it evoked a bit of that feeling. It's not terribly long. It's 317 pages, so it's relatively short, so it's not terribly long, and it did read fairly quickly for me, which is rare because usually I read fairly slowly, but I was intentionally making sure that I read it rather rapidly so that I could make my way through it and finish it before I left. And also so that I wasn't making Liam wait for so long for me to finish it, because I do read really slowly and he reads a lot quicker than I do. So really, there were several things going for it, and I think that I should have enjoyed it a little bit more than I actually did. But herein lies the issue. I also feel like this book was supposed to be very theme heavy and philosophical, and it acts as if it's trying to be very deep and literary, much the same complaint as I had with The Once and Future King. And to some degree it was very, very deep and literary to some degree. It seemed like it was trying really hard to say something profound and impactful, but just didn't quite hit as hard as I wanted it to. There was a lot of symbolism, as usually is when it's a more contemplative or a more philosophical book, but I'll fully admit that I wanted the author to dig into it even more. I felt like it was not quite enough, not quite packing the punch that it was supposed to. Using an Arthurian tale to explore death and aging and memory, as well as a refusal to forget past wrongs, is a really good idea. This is exactly where Arthuriana shines. But this is the same problem that I had with The Once and Future King. It was almost something great, but it just didn't quite become what it needed to at the end. And that's the same thing here. I also do think that I saw a little bit of like a Orpheus and Eurydice, which I was all for, and the more times that the more things like that I can see, the more influences of other stories that I can see, especially since that's what the Arthurian tale is pulling references from all these other stories. I'm happy to see that. I'd be lying if I just said that I didn't enjoy the book, because really I did. I enjoyed the journey of reading it and getting to discuss it with Liam. Just I didn't enjoy it as much as I had hoped for or expected to. Some of the explanations of things that could have been really interesting to tie into the themes, they just kind of fell flat for me, because it was just like, oh, this one's magic, and you're like, but it could have been something so interesting, or the way you did it could have been something so interesting. The explanation of the mist was one of those things. Also, the knight that they chose to include in this story, his personality seemed a little bit different than his personality normally is in Arthurian literature. And it seems like had they not placed that name with this character, it would have been better. If they would have, for example, used Sir Pellinor or something like that, it would have fit the character better than the knight that they chose to go with. The knight that they chose to go with is a little bit of a reveal, so I'm not going to say the name of them, but yeah, it's the one that they chose to go with just didn't feel like it. Okay, obviously this is a different story. The author can do whatever he wants to. That's fine. I'm not opposed to that. But I feel like the image that we have and the personality that we know for the knight with this specific name is not the image and the idea that the personality that was used for this book. And I'm not saying that's wrong. I'm just saying that for me, I wish it would have been a different knight that they would have used here, especially since the personality was very different than we normally see for the knight of that name. I didn't like the relationship between Beatrice and Axel. I feel like Axel was fine, but I actually strongly disliked Beatrice from the beginning of the book, and then that never changed. And it seems like she was only ever concerned about herself and had no reciprocal love or respect for Axel. And that's not something that I wanted to see, which in the end, the way the book ended, I was like, okay, I don't hate that ending, largely due to how the characters interact and stuff like that throughout the rest of the book. Overall, I had a good time reading the book, and especially discussing it with Liam. That's always a highlight of doing something like a buddy read, is you get to have some discussion. But the book as a whole didn't quite satisfy me the way that I wanted it to, especially from an Arthurian tale written to be more literary than actiony. And I've talked about this with Earthsea, how I loved that it was more philosophical, more contemplative than it was actiony, although there was still some action. And that's the same thing here. There is still some action, but primarily it's about the themes. And unfortunately, the themes just didn't quite resonate as strongly as I needed them to and as I wanted them to. So this one, maybe this is a little bit of expectations were too high and it couldn't meet my expectations. But I also think that there were some moments where I'm like, why didn't you just dig a little bit more into that and explore that just a little bit more, and it would have been more impactful. And they didn't quite, and so it's unfortunate. But at the same time, I'm not going to say that it's a bad book, because I did enjoy it, but it's not my favorite book I've ever read. So anyways, that is my review for The Buried Giant by Kazuo Ishiguro. Thank you for watching an Erudite Adventure. We will see you guys again soon. Stay warm.